went to North Wolfsboro and stopped a short time and then went to Wolfsboro, where we purchased some cloth and built a tent and camped out near Captain Roberts, whose family used us with great kindness. We slept in our tent and had our office there, and took our meals at Mr. Chadbourne's, by whom we were kindly treated. Whilst here, I used to leave my camp in charge of my dog, who would not let any person take anything from the tent, excepting our circulars, which were on a table in the middle of our tent. If a person touched anything besides these, while we were gone, my dog would go and look up in his face and growl, as much as to say, "If you know when you are well off, you will put that down." When we went to our meals, we used to leave the dog in our tent, and when we went to visit patients, he was the most intelligent animal I ever saw, and helped us enormously in our travels. I used to travel considerable upon the Boston and Maine Railroad, and when I first took my dog with me, the conductor told me that I could not take him in the cars with me. I told him that if my dog could go in the cars, I could not. And after some little parleying, he concluded to let my dog go, and would always ask my dog where his ticket was when he came to us in the cars. And with an intelligent look, the dog would gaze up into the conductor's face and bark, and the conductor would pass on. I had to go some distance to get ash to make into baskets, and lugging it out of the swamps, I would load up my cart and haul it to the home. I shot a great many squirrels with my bow and arrow, and I practiced much with my bow while here, and could kill at as great a distance as the small guns would when we used them. My wife, while here, was visited by a great many deaf people, and I had to do all the talking when they came to the tent, and I used to get almost worn out, and sometimes I have no doubt I was a little cross, for it is a fact that deaf people want to talk a great deal more than others, and my lungs were well exercised while there. I think I never saw a place where there were so many deaf people as at this place. We went next to Freedom and had our camp near the village, and we did very well there, and I saved up some considerable money. My wife's folks came here while then giving exhibitions, and soon went away again. I bought me a horse which I kept in the rear of the store, which I hired and moved into. One night I was awakened by the noise of some person trying to open the door. And my dog, hearing the noise, sprung through the glass in the door, and by the nose and struggling upon the outside, I had not much doubt but that my dog had grappled with someone, and I hurried to the door and saw a man making off down the road, when he jumped into a pung wagon where there was another man, and drove off. I found at the door some shreds of clothing, showing that my dog had made some havoc in the garment of the person, if nothing more. A short time after, I took my team, and with my wife I went after a load of firewood, my dog following along behind. I loaded up my team and started homeward, and while going along, I noticed my dog lingered along behind, gnawing a bone. I did not take much notice of it until I saw him stagger, and remembering that a short distance back he had run down to a brook to drink, and I came to the conclusion that he had been poisoned. I went up to a house and got some oil and gave it him, but it was too late. The poison had begun to do its work, and he grew weaker and weaker and shortly died. I felt very sorrowful at losing him, for he had always proved himself a friend to me, at sharing as he had many times one half of my meal. He never proved treacherous on any occasion, but was always faithful, warning me of danger and ever ready to defend me or my property. I would much rather have lost my horse or steers, yes, all that I have, than had parted with my dog. But he was gone, and I brushed away the tears that filled my eyes, and having engaged a man to bury him, I returned home to my camp, feeling rather sorrowful. We shortly moved to Newfield, and while on the road, 2 men came driving up behind us and rather saucily cried out for us to get out of the road. The snow was pretty deep, and my sled was loaded. My wife was behind me in the sled, and as they came up, one of them jumped out and ran forward to my horse's head. My horse had a trick of biting everyone that came very near him, and as the fellow got pretty near, he seized him by the arm and threw him down. The man was not used to this kind of action, and was somewhat surprised, and got up, vowing vengeance against my horse. But I told the man that he had better let him alone. He did not say anything more, but pulling his sleigh out upon the side of the road, they passed by us. We stopped at Newfield with a man named Newbegin, and while here some of my wife's folks came to visit us, and the man that brought them I had to pay $9 for their fare, and also had to buy an extra tent to accommodate them, and soon after 2 of my wife's brothers came, and I paid $7 to the man that brought them, as they came in an extra team. I thought that was rather hard upon me. This seemed a new way of paying visits, making me pay their fare for their passage, probably thinking that the great pleasure I should experience in seeing their faces would be more than sufficient to balance the bills. I did not think so, but was much better satisfied when they left than when they came. We moved from here to Limerick, Maine, where I hired a room under Squire Lord's office room, who made me agree when I entered that I would not make a disturbance while there, but my wife's brothers were with me, and they were a noisy set. They used to fiddle and dance, and then often the squire would rap on the floor for them to stop their noise. My wife's folks got into debt here, and I had to settle the bills. They rode on horse and drove him very hard, and upon the whole, I thought I was rather treated badly, and determined the first good opportunity that I had, I would leave. A friend of mine asked me one day if I did not wish to go over and see my sister. I told him my situation and that I had got sick and tired of living in the way I did. I therefore took my horse and got a carriage and started with my friend to go to my sister's, not letting my wife or her brothers know where I was going. I went at first to an uncle's and stopped a few days, and then went to Mr. Bowden's, my sister's husband, who had recently moved to Lymington, where I met my father, this being the third time that we had met since I was recognized as his son. The first night I was there, I had quite a long conversation with my sister, who asked me about my wife and my life with the Indians, and if I could remember anything before I was taken by them. I told her that I could not remember anything distinctly, and then she repeated the following little prayer that she had said I used to repeat to her when I laid down to sleep. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. My sister then asked me if I had no recollection of repeating this little prayer. Whilst my sister was repeating it, a vision of my childhood seemed to float in my mind. Those little verses had awakened some glimpses of far days back in my life, that indistinct recollection of a little prayer that had floated in my memory, but which I could not grasp. But when my mind was set upon the task of recollecting it, it would take its flight. Now burst afresh from my memory, and then I could almost realize distinctly the time when they were repeated me at my bedside. Now all doubts at my being the lost child in my mind were dissipated, and from that moment I felt that I had a dear father, kind brothers, and loving sisters, and yet it seemed strange, alone as I had always been, looking on no one as near to me, to be thus surrounded by friends, and made me feel extremely happy. Before this, I had no desire to be with the whites, no desire to find friends amongst them. But from that conversation with my sister, I was led to look at life in a somewhat different light than I had before. I remained here a few days, and then I went to Biddeford, where I stopped with my brother Samuel about a week, and then went to Lymington, and from there to Limerick, where I commenced to go to the academy, my tuition being paid by Dr. Fogg, and my board being given me by Mr. Cotton Bean. Both of these gentlemen had proved themselves strong friends to me. Not being accustomed to confinement, I find in about 3 weeks that I could not stand it, and I had to give up going to school, and started back to Biddeford, where I commenced to practice medicine, and did well, having quite an extensive practice. I went up to Stowe a few weeks after I came to Biddeford, and my brother Samuel, thinking that I was rather long and something must have happened, got a horse, and with another man went after me, thinking that I would have been likely to stop at Mr. Abbott's, a great friend of mine in Freiburg, which I did so. He called there and inquired for me. There were none of the menfolks at home, and none of the women knew my brother Samuel, and they thought that my brother was a man sent to carry me back to the Indians, and they thought that they would detain my brother and his companion that was with him until the menfolk came home. They therefore asked them to stop and get something to eat, and kept a pretty lively conversation, but all to no purpose, for my brother was bound to keep on, and when finding that they could not stop them, they let them go. They had no sooner left the house than one of Mr. Abbott's sons came home, and his mother telling him the circumstances, he harnessed up a horse and started for Stowe, taking a different road than the one my brother went, and somewhat longer, and just as my brother Samuel drove up to the house where I was stopping, young Abbott came, and they both entered the house at the same time. I introduced my brother Samuel to Abbott, who, after finding that Samuel was my brother and explaining the matter, had a hearty laugh over it. We all started back and stopped at Mr. Abbott's to tea, explaining the circumstances to them, who were much pleased at the knowledge of the happening. My brother and his companions and myself kept on that night as far as Sebago, and stopped at Deacon Haley's, and the following day went to Lymington, where I stopped at Mr. Matson's, whilst the others kept on to Bideford. I remained in Lymington about a week, and then went to Limerick, and there sold my horse to Isaac Bean, who at first was somewhat afraid to purchase, not knowing whether my title to him was not good or was not worthy, as the Newells had accused me of running away with their horse. But after getting Squire Lord to write to the man I purchased the horse of, and receiving a satisfactory answer, he bought him. I then went to Saco, stopping with my cousin Daniel Johnson, and commenced to practice medicine again. While there, I heard that some Indians intended to go down to the pool and have a boat race with some whites, and being well acquainted with them, I went down to the fast-sailing steamer Halifax with the Indians, and I saw the boat race at the pool, the Indians paddling their canoe against a 4-oared boat. But the Indians were beaten, as they had a very poor canoe. I was well pleased to meet with the Indians, and promised to meet one of them at the covered bridge, and go with them to Portland. After returning from the pool, I went to my boarding place, and getting some things that I wanted, I told them that I had to visit a patient, and after getting out of the house, I hurried down to the covered bridge. But the Indian was not there, having got tired of waiting for me. I therefore hurried up to the Bridgeport depot, just in time to take the cars for Portland, and found the Indians on board. and they were very glad to see me. We arrived at Portland, and from there went to Cape Elizabeth, where I found my wife and her folks. I was glad to see my wife and her father, who had always used me well, and was a very kind man. He was exempt from many habits and indulgences that the Indians are accustomed to, as he never swore, or used tobacco, or drank strong drinks, which may perhaps account for his long life and his remarkable health, as he was never, to my knowledge, sick, and now is about 100 years old, yet smart and active, and they were very glad to see me. But I told them that I was only there on a visit and intended to leave again soon. My father, who now lived in Biddeford, hearing that I had gone to Portland, came in to see me the next day after I arrived there, and taking me outside of the tent, endeavored to persuade me to go back with him. But I had been so long accustomed to the Indians, I seemed to feel at home amongst them, and did not feel disposed to go back. My father, finding that I would not go back, invited me to call and see him whenever I had an opportunity, which I promised to do, and he then left me and returned home. My wife's brother, wishing to keep me with them, began to talk of getting up an exhibition and wanted me to help them. As always, I had a turn for that kind of life. I entered heartily into it and went and engaged the City Hall at Portland, and having about $100, bought some curtains, dressers, and other things, using up most of my money. I procured some bills and had them posted up, and before I got through, I used up all of my money. As the other ones did not have any, I agreed to furnish the money and purchase the things. And the first night we were to go shares, and after that the company were to hire out to me for so much a night for their services. The first night the hall was full, some 8 or 10 people I should judge, and the tickets were 25 cents. Yet at the close of the evening, the ticket seller gave the money to me in a small box, which after dividing amongst us, we had $4.60 apiece, and only 8 of us in the company. We had 2 men that we had hired to take and sell tickets, and whether or not they cheated, I do not know. But I do know that some of the company sold tickets before the performance and kept the money, not giving any account of it. I then expected to play the following night, but those that had engaged to play for me refused, and I was thus left some $100 short, hoping or having to show for it about half the amount in properties. The rest of the company engaged Deering's Hall and advertised to play on Monday night, as we had plays on Saturday evenings, but as the curtains and dresses were mine, and they had no fixtures at all, they had to give it up. They therefore got put out with me, because I would not let them have the curtains and dresses that I own, and would not have anything to do with me, because I would not let them have my curtains and dresses, which provoked me, so that I packed up my things and went with my wife to Wells Depot, and we stopped here about a week, making baskets and selling them in the village. But as it was a small place, we left it and went to North Berwick, where we camped in Walnut Grove, where we made and sold baskets. We next went to Elliott, Maine, and camped by the side of the railroad. We stopped here about a fortnight, but as we could not sell many baskets, we got entirely out of money. We went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we heard that there were some Indians at Kittery Point, and taking some baskets, we traveled over there, selling our baskets as we went along. But not finding any Indians, we went back to Portsmouth. We then took the cars and went to Hampton, camping out there and making baskets, selling quite a number. And here we fell in with my wife's brother, who was camping out as well. We went to Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, where we made quite a number of baskets and did very well. We next went to Hingham, Massachusetts, where we found some Indians of the Penobscot tribe. My wife practiced medicine, which with our making and selling baskets brought us considerable money. We shortly went then to Alton Bays, New Hampshire, but not doing very well there, we remained but a few days, and then hired a team and had our things carried to Wolfsboro while we walked, and as it was raining hard, we got completely drenched with water. I had some trouble with my wife's folks packing up my things. I had sent them to Leamington, whilst I started off afoot and alone and walked to Limerick, and was from there carried by a friend to my sister's in Leamington. I traveled around the country a short time, visiting my friends, and then went to Saco, where I commenced to practice. I did very well there, but I had been there a short time before I received a letter from my wife, who said that she wished me to send her some money, or to come and get her, as she had to raise money by pawning many things that she had, and was now in poor circumstances. I went up soon after, and redeeming the things, we went to Biddeford and boarded with Mr. Mason upon Poole Street. But we had been there a short time before my wife's folks came to visit us, and as I did not wish to pay their board, I hired a tenement and moved to Factory Island in Saco. One of my wife's brothers went with me, and as he wished for a place where he could make bows and arrows, I hired a small shop and fitted it up, putting in hair oils and medicines, and let him tend it. I found after a short time that my things began to disappear, and I went over one day with the intention of taking them out of the shop, but I arrived there too late, for my things were nearly all gone, and the young man had cleared out. I had paid the rent for the shop in advance, and as I did not like where I lived at that time, I moved into the shop. And while living there, I commenced to build me a tent upon Factory Island Hills. But just before I moved into it, I was taken sick. But recovering somewhat, I moved in. It was damp weather, and taking a cold, I was confined to my bed for some time. And after recovering, I collected some of the money that was due me, and then went to the pool that I might regain my health in the town. We had been at the pool but a few days before the floating palace, a steamboat carrying a circus company, came into the harbor, and I hired out with the proprietor to travel with it. I left with the company, leaving my wife at Poole, and went as far east as Bangor, where, finding that I was not able to endure the fatigue, I settled up and left the company. I went back to Cape Elizabeth, where I found my wife, and we went out to Saco, and there down to the town of Poole in the steamer Halifax, the captain giving us a free passage, and otherwise treating us kindly. I had some furniture at Poole, and I waited for the boat for 3 days, but the weather was so bad that it did not come, and being impatient to get away, I walked with my wife to Saco, leaving word for part of my things to be sent up as soon as the boat commenced to run. After getting my things, we went to Nantasket, Massachusetts, where we camped out, and my wife practiced medicine there, and with making and selling baskets, we did well. We next went to Cohasset and camped near the depot. Some of my wife's folks came along while we were there, and we commenced to give exhibitions. After traveling with the company a number of weeks, we left and went to East Braintree, where we stopped a short time and then moved to Quincy. At this place, I was troubled exceedingly by the Irish, who came to my camping grounds many times after that. And one day, while I was sitting outside of my tent, Father Sullivan, an Irish priest, hearing that I was against the Catholics, came up where I was sitting to give me a talking to. He was a thin, spare man and rather ignorant, but thought that the importance of his situation would make him known, and that great respect and deference should be shown his worship. "And where do you belong?" he asked me rather sharply. "I belong to the Penobscot tribe at Old Town," I replied. "I know you don't. You don't belong to any such tribe," he said. "If you know better than I do, you may tell my story," I said. Finding that I was not afraid of him, he asked me how long ago I was there. "I travel," I replied, "most of the time." I know it. You are not good enough to stop there. You are not good enough to go there. Don't you go there, for you will spoil them." And then he asked what my name was. I told him that I was called John Glossian, and sometimes John Lowisian, and that I belong to the Penobscot tribe. I know you don't, he said, for I know all about you, for you are not an Indian. He replied. I had subdued as much as possible my temper, but I began now to be angry at the rude manner in which he addressed me, and I ordered him to leave the ground. This made him very excited, and he jumped around, pronouncing execrations against me, and told me to shut up. I told him there was no Catholic priest that could stop me from talking, and ordered him to leave. But as he did not feel disposed to do so, I jumped up, and seizing him by the shoulders, I turned him around and kicked him into the street, and as it was descending ground, he went there in a hurry. This was the last I ever saw of Father Sullivan, but the Irish were greatly enraged at the manner I treated their priest, and they took every occasion to annoy me. We next went to Bangor, and from there to Old Town, where we stopped about 6 weeks. While I was at Old Town, the city marshal of Bangor and another officer came there to look after John Newell, and as the officer did not know Newell, they mistook him for me, or me for him. Newell had eloped with a young white girl from South Boston, and the father had sent an officer to find them. The Indians at Old Town imagined that it was some great crime that the young man was guilty of, and they asked me to go to Boston and hunt up Newell. I went to Bangor and then went into a saloon and got something to eat before going onto the board of the boat for Boston. Whilst I was in the saloon, an officer came in and asked me what I had done with the girl that I ran away with. I told him that the girl was not a great distance off, and the officer said that I must go to Boston with him. But finding that I was not willing to go, he suspected that I was not the one he was after, and he asked me if my name was Newell. I told him that it was not, and he soon found upon inquiry that he had been mistaken. I went to Boston and to the camping grounds of the Indians, where in a few days after I arrived, Newell came, and after finding that the affair in which he was concerned was settled up, I went back to Old Town and then went with my wife to Portland, as it was about the time the Great Eastern was expected, and built me a camp on the head of the wharf that she was expected to stop at. I made up a great many baskets, as I supposed that I could sell all that I could make after the steamer arrived. As it was expected, there would be a great number of people in the city, and after stopping until the middle of November, waiting for the appearance of the great steamer, I found that it was a great humbug, and that I had made all my preparations for nothing, for the steamer did not come. But I consoled myself with the thought that I was not the only one that had been disappointed. I left my things at Portland and went with my wife to Sabbatsville, where some of my wife's folks were. I felt considerable trouble with my wife's brothers while there, as they endeavored to oppose upon me every opportunity that they had. And after a short time I left and walked to Green, where an uncle of mine lived, and while I stopped there for a few days, and then went with my wife out to Bideford and down to the town of Poole to see some of my things that were left there, calling upon the way upon some of my folks. A short time after, I went back to Green, and I bought an Ambro-type saloon at Buckfield and moved into it, where we stopped for a few months. We moved our saloon to Paris Hill, where we engaged a situation in front of the house where the Honorable Hannibal Hamlin was born, but was then occupied by Mr. Chase of Portland as a summer residence. A fine man, to whom with his family I am indebted for many acts of kindness shown to me, and the place was in a beautiful situation, commanding a fine view of the surrounding scenery and a very healthy and desirable location, as it was the center of a rich and fruitful country. I moved from this place to South Paris, placing my saloon opposite the depot, whilst here my wife was in poor health, so that she could not practice, and shutting up my saloon and procuring me my necessary things, I prepared for a journey to the lakes and Oxford County. The morning we started was one of the most beautiful mornings of the season, and with a good double-barreled gun and with my dog at my side, we started off for a tour to the lakes. The first day we arrived at Rumford Corner, where we stopped overnight, and in the morning resumed our journey, continuing our way for a short distance to Ellis River, where we launched a birch canoe that we had bought and took our course up the river, our dog swimming along behind and at times running along upon the shore. This was the most winding and tortuous stream that I ever saw, and in one place, by carrying our canoes about 4 rods across a strip of lands, we saved more than a mile of distance by water. And in some 3 days after we started, we arrived at Andover, where we stopped a week waiting for a team to go into the lakes to take our things. One night as we were camped there, and as I camped by the side of the river, I went out after muskrats. By imitating a noise that they make, persons may call them around their canoes if they are near. I called one up to the canoe, but as he came up at the side, I was afraid to fire, fearful that I might lose my balance, as the concussion would be great upon the canoe. I therefore paddled my canoe around, and the rat dived into the waters and came up at the side again. And this was continued for some time, until at last, somewhat excited, I fired from the side, and the result was that the canoe was overturned, and I was precipitated into the water. I had to drop my gun in the water, and which was after then some 15 feet deep, so as to enable to reach the shore. I heard my dog, hearing the report of my gun, slipped his head from his collar and ran down to the river, and taking my canoe, I went out to fish up my gun from the river. And a few days after, we started for the lakes, walking through the woods in a miserable road, and hearing that there was a camp near the lake, we went into it. But it was in such a miserable condition that we left it and built us a camp near the lake. The team that had our things came in a few days after, bringing our provisions, which we were glad to see, as we were entirely out. We stopped at the lakes a number of days, spending our time in fishing and gunning, having fine times. I caught some beautiful salmon trout, and also speared salmon in the rapids, between the lakes, in the night, by the light of torches, which is very exciting work. After visiting several different parts of the lakes, and enjoying much a few days that we spent there, somewhat reluctantly, we turned our faces homeward, and we journeyed down the lake in our canoe, and we arrived opposite Metallic Point. It blew so furiously that we had to go ashore, and we went to a place that was called the farmhouse, the place the hunters always made a home there, and there were many conveniences for those who made it their quarters. To save gathering wood for a fire, they used to knock down some of the inside work and cut it up for fuel. I found that some of the hunters were stopping there at this time, and from in one of the rooms I saw quite a lot of skins of different animals hanging around the room, and there was also a number of partridges, and my wife's appetite was rather poor, and we were entirely out of provisions. I took a couple and made a stew of those partridges, feeling that the emergency of the case would justify the act. We started the next day and went down the lake to the Narrows, where I camped with a man named Leonard, who was there with a small company. I acted a cook, and they were much pleased with my modes of cooking, and I had a very pleasant time while stopping there, and after stopping a few days, we started across the woods. We came to one very beautiful spot. Whilst walking through the woods, there is one place where the travelers generally cross. It is a narrow cut between two high cliffs upon each side, and through this narrow defile a stream of water rushes swiftly down a bed of rocks. And at the time we were there, the stream was swollen, and it was with extreme difficulty that we were enabled to cross. A short distance down where we crossed, the narrow defile seemed filled with the spray of water, and the rays of the sun shining upon the mist above the rocky sides gave a deep, dark hue to the spray below. It was a brilliant scene from the riverbed up to where the sunlight fell upon the mist. There were changing colors, alternating as the rays of the sun lifted upwards, and we stopped to view this beautiful scene, but while gazing, those bright hues disappeared, and the darkness indicated the approach of night, and we turned reluctantly away and continued our homeward march. At night we arrived at Andover, where we stopped a few days, and selling our canoe and procuring a carriage, as my wife was not well, I carried her to Andover Corner, where we stopped with Mr. Roberts. We here took the stage for Woodstock, New Hampshire, but I had rode a short distance before I missed my dog, and getting out, I started back to find him, and went back some distance before I did find him, and I started to walk for Woodstock then, getting a ride part of the distance with a man who overtook me on the road. I rode with this man through Bethel, where he showed me a house where there was a child named Wilbur, stolen by the Indians many years before. And after leaving the man, I kept on towards Woodstock, where I arrived in a short time and found my wife there. From there, we went south to Paris, where we stopped until November, practicing medicine, and then moved to our saloon in Bridgetown, where I stopped for part of the winter of 1860. I wanted, while here, to see my folks, and we started one day and walked to Deacon Haley's at Sebago, and I went a-hunting one day while there for partridges. I found that it was an excellent place to hunt, for a person might hunt all day without seeing anything. I next started with my wife to see my folks, and secured a passage to Steep Falls, and from there I walked to Hollis, where I supposed my father still lived. But meeting a person with whom I was acquainted, to my surprise, he said that my father had moved to Biddeford. I was much disappointed at this piece of information, as I intended to surprise my father, as it was Thanksgiving Day. I stopped that night at my uncle's, and the next morning we were carried a short distance upon our way, and then walked the remainder of the distance to Salmon Falls, stopping overnight with a friend of mine. The next day we continued on our journey and walked to Biddeford, where I found my father. I stopped with him about a week, and then went to Lymington, where I found that I had left home of my things some time before, and I built me a sled while here, and as my dog was large and stout, I harnessed him in. At first he was somewhat rebellious, but after some little coercion he became more docile, and at last went along very well. I stopped at Sebago one night, and then went to Bridgeton, where my saloon was, and where I stopped for a few days. Whilst here, my wife was taken sick, and as I had no conveniences at my place, I went with my wife to Biddeford again, and stopped with my father. My wife was not recovering her health, and as she wished to see her folks, who were then stopping at Old Town, when somewhat recovered, she left my father's and went there in March last, and there she has remained since that time. Many of the incidents that have occurred whilst with the Indians are necessarily omitted, as it was intended to make a small volume, and we have also endeavored to state incidents as they occurred, and in a truthful manner. And if we have erred upon this side, it is in not giving full force to them, and presenting occurrences as they actually were. But we had rather err upon this side than to give that fictitious cast and high coloring which is now generally done in all reading that is presented to the public. And high coloring.